Hey all, here at OS Reviews. In this video we are taking a throwback look at the BlackBerry Q5 here in 2020. And it was a contemporary to devices like the Q10 and the Z10, which is a fully touchscreen device. What's interesting about the BlackBerry 10 operating system though is the hardware on all of the phones are pretty similar. It was a Qualcomm Snapdragon S4 Pro chipset clocked at 1.5 GHz, along with 2 GB of built-in RAM, the same across their other phones. So the performance across all of these devices were pretty similar despite minor differences in their appearance. What's more fascinating is there are newer phones released after the Q5. The BlackBerry Classic in particular actually shares specs which are pretty much still the same compared to the Q5, just in a slightly larger body built with more premium materials including aluminum, compared to this one which is made entirely out of polycarbonate plastic. And that was the reason why the Q5 here was their budget-oriented model, even though the performance and hardware inside was the same basically as any other BlackBerry 10 phone. So you can think of this as a light version of a BlackBerry Classic. Before we dive too deep into the software, let's take a closer look at the design first. The screen here measures 3.1 inches diagonally. It's a IPS LCD panel which offers pretty good viewing angles and actually surprisingly good visibility even in brighter conditions. It is a capacitive multi-touch enabled display which offers support for pinch to zoom and other gestures, and it's pretty smooth and responsive, albeit a pretty small one by 2020 standards. Still, that's part of the reason why we have that QWERTY keyboard for text entry. Just one thing to really make note of here is that this is not a phone that's really designed for media, because if you're watching videos, the screen here, which is a perfect square, is just going to show content here in a pretty small area with significant letterboxing on the top and the bottom portions. Really, it's just meant for productivity. Things like light web browsing and writing emails, composing messages is what this phone is all about, even when it was first released. Now otherwise, there is access to a front-facing camera, which is about 2 megapixels for video chatting. Down below here we have the BlackBerry logo, but there is no tool belt, as classic BlackBerry users will know. So there's a lack of an optical trackpad and the typical keys that we found on older BlackBerries. And that's because with BlackBerry OS 10, you're able to control everything using the touchscreen itself. So for example, if we go into something like an app here, I can simply swipe up from the bottom basically to exit out of that and close it up. Down below here, we have a classic keyboard, which BlackBerry really is known for. It's slightly split and slanted, but otherwise offers a chiclet island layout. And trust me when I say that the keyboard is still excellent. It's super tactile and responsive. Timeless in really how tactile it is and how accurate you can get just with a little bit of practice. You can start typing anywhere on the home screen to pull up the universal search, which will go through all of your applications and find relevant information, and that's a pretty neat feature of having this keyboard. On the bottom here, there is a microphone and a loudspeaker, which the quality of is actually quite good, and I'll jump into a demo here later on in this video. The rear also packs a 5 megapixel autofocus camera with LED flash. Photography has always been a slightly weaker spot of BlackBerries traditionally, and this camera is really just average as far as being functional, but nothing too noteworthy. On the side, there's a SIM card slot, micro USB for charging, standard 3.5mm headphone jack on the top, and a dedicated power on-off key on the very top, which is still relatively easy to reach because of the phone's smaller dimensions. And then finally on the other side, there's access to a volume rocker, and on the middle, you have access to a voice assistant key. Now the BlackBerry Q5 also came in other colors, including red, as well as a more traditional black, so the color schemes were also a bit more playful and vibrant. Now in the Android world, there is another phone that reminds me a little bit of this in terms of the design, and that would be the HTC Status, which was also dubbed as the Facebook phone. This device is a little bit older, but it's another device that has a touchscreen in addition to a QWERTY keyboard, and then here is a quick look at the size difference of the devices. Now returning back to the software side of things, this is a very elegant UI that was pretty ahead of the curve in terms of implementing gestures. Swipe up from the bottom bezel, just like now on Android devices since Android Pie, just like with the latest iOS phones. The neat trick of all BB10 devices is you can wake up the screen not by double tapping, but by swiping from the bottom to the top of the panel, and that kind of gently wakes it up. From the main screen here, we're able to see things like quick notifications that's represented represented by this bell icon, which you can tap on to take a look at. This main screen here is composed of all of our open applications, which the phone can juggle in its RAM. So just as a quick example here, we have two of them running, and it will show additional tiles and a scrollable list as you have more and more apps that you want to keep open and then jump back and forth between. It's pretty seamless. The other pages are dedicated to your applications presented in a grid layout, similar to iOS. And the UI still keeps up quite well, and optimization is done very nicely. One of the biggest limitations at the time was the App Store for BlackBerry OS X was quite limited, offering just a slice of what iOS and Android could provide. That is, if you are considering this phone in 2020, you really should be a legacy BlackBerry user. That is, you've operated and used one of the older BlackBerries in the past and have already set things up in the past and had an account. Because if you're buying a new device as a new user, it's actually very tough now to still enroll and even look for apps in the BlackBerry world, because this operating system has been discontinued and the plugs are starting to be disconnected and severed, as here in 2020, even license deals between BlackBerry and the hardware company TCL, which are making their newest generation of Android phones, is also coming to a close. However, one alternative is the Amazon App Store, which the phone does also support. And that might be one of the best features of BB10 OS is it does support some Android APK files, with the slogan that you can basically still download regular Android apps for it. And although that definitely was true back in 2014, here in 2020, unfortunately one limitation is the version of Android that this is basically emulating is quite old. You have to ensure that the app is designed for phones as old as Android 4.0, because technically if you try and install, say, an Android 8.0 or 9.0 app, it's not going to be supported since this is emulating an older version of Android. Otherwise, default apps that we have built on in include a web browser, which we'll take a closer look at in a moment. There's access to a version of Documents to Go, which is very handy. And over here, we have some additional functions for things like utility tools, such as their clock and stopwatch. And all of these are designed pretty well in terms of their interface. It looks still very modern and attractive, in my opinion. Now, we're also able to swipe down from the main screen here to access our notification tray to do things like access quick toggles for the wireless. Finally, towards the left of all of this includes a screen here, which instead of being, say, for news that's aggregated like on Android or iOS, it features the BlackBerry Hub. And what the Hub does is it aggregates all of your networking as well as email needs through a server that BlackBerry provides for additional security. Text messages, messages sent through their own messaging client app, and it's all going to show up in the Hub, which is a pretty convenient spot. If we start with the camera here very quickly, as aforementioned, it's nothing to really write home about. In fact, even out of BlackBerry phones at the time, it was not really the strongest, just because of it had only a 5 megapixel sensor. Of course, megapixels aren't everything, but it's really not anything to write home about. The interface is super straightforward, but at least it is quite easy to use and functional. We can do things like choose flash options. There is HDR that we can toggle on or off, which is neat. And there's also something called time shift, which basically if it detects that there's a person's face, it will capture a burst shot, a series of images, and then you're able to select frame by frame in case someone has blinked. HDR shot here of the sky can still make out some of the textures, which looks quite decent. It isn't the fastest camera in the world in terms of focusing, but overall it's still, again, functional for capturing some quick images here and there, and you still get a decent amount of details, and with some patience you can get some nice enough looking shots. Jump into whether the web browsing component still works or not. We can jump into the browser here and try out some different pages. And a trick that I really like in BlackBerry 10 is they put the address bar towards the bottom of the screen as opposed to the top, which requires you to really stretch your fingers. But because it's on the bottom, it's actually still very easy to hit using your thumb along with the keyboard, and it will load us here. So as a whole, performance is actually still not bad at all when it comes to the smoothness and responsiveness. If we want to try and search something like The Verge, the loading speed here is also really not bad. It takes a little bit longer compared to, say, our latest flagships for things to load. But again, even back in its heyday, this was not really a flagship compared to some Android phones which already had quad or octa-core chipsets. Again, this was more of a mid-tier CPU option, but at least it still is functional, and even now we can still kind of read back content without getting any error messages. Speaking of, if we jump into YouTube, as aforementioned, it will open up a mobile version of the YouTube site, which is in fact still functional. Takeaway from the speaker quality here is it's also surprisingly decent. Even though it's not a stereo speaker, at least it's not located in the rear, so it's not that easy to cover up accidentally. And the quality itself is surprisingly decent. It doesn't really distort. For listening to some music with, it really doesn't serve any issues as far as the functionality is concerned. As for other aspects of the phone, such as the voice assistant, you can basically talk to it just by long holding on the center key, sandwiched between the volume controls. It does work, however, it is rather primitive compared to offerings from Google and Apple, in the sense that it can't really talk back to you and answer intelligent questions in a human-like fashion, but rather it can do some things if you ask it to, such as setting an alarm, sending a message, looking things up. Hello. You can see that it really won't be able to answer that question. The voice request wasn't understood, but you are able to do things like the aforementioned, create a calendar event, set an alarm, reminder, search the internet, but it has to be rather specific. So that's more or less it as far as our revisited look at the BlackBerry Q10. Again, really a light version of the BlackBerry Classic is how you can think of it as. It still functions quite well in terms of the UI navigation, and for things like making phone calls, basic organization, light web browsing, and document editing, it still does quite well. However, the caveat here is app support here in 2020 is still a huge pain point. It actually has gotten, again, kind of worse, as it seems BlackBerry's future remains a question mark, looming past 2020. However, it was still a very neat piece of tech history, and again, the general fluidity of the UI and operating system is still surprisingly nice and fluid, and offers very intuitive gestures which were ahead of the curve. Of course, one of the biggest benefits, though, of something like this is the price has come down very significantly. The BlackBerry Q10, Q5, and also the BlackBerry Classics can all be found online, typically for under $50, sometimes as low as $20, which is just super cheap in very much budget territory for a no-contract phone, if, again, just for basic calling and text is what you're looking for. But anyways, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That was kind of a nostalgic look back at the BlackBerry Q5, BlackBerry 10 in general, and you can check out more details if you are interested in the links down below. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews.